The Vietnam War commenced with noble intentions and efforts by well-intentioned individuals, but as 2 decades passed, the fate of the Vietnamese people was sealed. It wasn't merely a battle against communism, it was a quest for independence, a struggle for Vietnam itself. However, a combination of American hubris, Cold War tensions, and the very imperialistic tendencies they had vehemently opposed turned the Vietnam War into one of America's most somber chapters in its relatively brief yet eventful history. By the conflict's conclusion, more than 58,000 Americans had perished, alongside 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Additionally, over 1 million North Vietnamese troops and Viet Cong guerrillas lost their lives, along with more than 2 million civilians from both the northern and southern regions, and thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. The French expansion into Indochina was reignited in 1858. They heralded the ascent of their civilization in Vietnam, initiating the construction of vital infrastructure like roads and bridges. However, the Vietnamese populace did not receive the French colonizers well, echoing their resistance against earlier Chinese invasions. To the Vietnamese, the French represented oppression, and the quest for independence intensified. In 1919, following the conclusion of the Great War, American President Woodrow Wilson journeyed to Paris to shape a new global order and championed the cause of liberation for colonized nations. During his time in France, a petitioner approached the president with a plea for Vietnam's independence, signed by himself and fellow Vietnamese nationalists. Though the president's secretary assured the petitioner of Wilson's attention, there is no evidence that the matter reached Wilson's desk. This petitioner would go by many aliases throughout his life, eventually adopting the most enlightened Ho Chi Minh. Following his involvement in a protest against the puppet emperor, Ho Chi Minh found himself targeted for arrest, prompting his flight from Vietnam in 1911. He endured 3 decades of exile. It was during this period that he encountered the anti-colonial doctrines of Lenin, embracing communism as his ideology, fervently advocating for an independent Vietnam. By 1940, amidst the upheaval of the Second World War, with Germany's conquest of much of Western Europe, including France and Japan's occupation of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh returned to his homeland. There, he laid the groundwork for a revolutionary movement dubbed the Viet Minh, which swiftly gained momentum, employing guerrilla tactics reminiscent of those employed decades later during the American intervention. In the spring of 1945, as the United States sought means to undermine Japanese forces in Vietnam, they found an unexpected ally in Ho Chi Minh. Through the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, arms were supplied to his guerrilla fighters, who adeptly mastered their use. Ho began referring to his followers as the Viet American Army, lauding the US as a beacon of democracy. With the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the impending surrender of Japan, Ho Chi Minh seized the moment, rallying the Vietnamese populace to assert their sovereignty before the French could reassert control. On September 2, 1945, amid the aftermath of Japan's surrender and the conclusion of World War II, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnamese independence to a throng of supporters in Ba Square, Hanoi. However, the promising outlook was overshadowed by the shifting geopolitical landscape. President Franklin Roosevelt, who had championed the cause of independence, self-governing state, was no more. His successor, Harry Truman, confronted a world in turmoil as the Soviet Union expanded its influence into Eastern Europe and beyond, marking the dawn of the Cold War. The French had issued a warning, expressing concern that if their colonies gained independence with American support, France might succumb to Soviet influence. With American aid, the French deployed thousands of soldiers back into Vietnam, In 1950, communist forces from North Korea launched an invasion of South Korea, heightening the domino theory significance, which posed that the spread of communism to one nation could lead to others failing as well. Responding to this, the United States dispatched tens of thousands of troops to repel the invaders successfully, demonstrating the containment of communism in Asia was possible. By 1953, after 7 years of fighting in Vietnam and enduring over 100,000 casualties, the French were exhausted. They faced relentless attacks from the Viet Minh, bolstered by Soviet and Chinese support. Demoralized, the French sought to initiate peace talks, but both sides attempted to strengthen their military positions beforehand. The French established a fortified base in Dien Bien Phu, confident in their ability to prevail. However, they underestimated the strategic advantage of the jungle-covered hills surrounding their position. With 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers besieged the valley and unleashed the heavy artillery, the French found themselves trapped. After enduring 55 days of intense assault, they surrendered, losing 8,000 troops. This defeat marked the end of a century of French colonial rule in Vietnam, instilling in Viet Minh a belief in their ability to overcome a major Western power. An armistice was signed, dividing Vietnam along the 17th parallel, prompting a mass exodus of refugees seeking refuge from communism in the South. The Republic of Vietnam was established, but its capital in Saigon, led by President Diem and protected by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh communist regime implemented harsh land reforms, resulting in widespread death and imprisonment. The Viet Cong, operating under the National Liberation Front, were determined to reunify Vietnam, using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to infiltrate the South. Though labeled as communist traitors by the US and its allies, they were formidable opponents against the backdrop of escalating Cold War tensions. President John F. Kennedy faced pressure to confront communist expansion. Despite initial reluctance, Kennedy's advisors urged him to deploy ground troops to support the South Vietnamese against the Viet Cong, given the perceived threat to global peace posed by aggressive dictatorships. He was cautioned that Vietnam must not succumb to communism. However, he balked at the idea of deploying troops. Instead, it dispatched an elite unit, the Great Berets, along with military advisors to train and bolster South Vietnam's armed forces. Additionally, Kennedy escalated support by doubling military funding and supplying helicopters and armored vehicles. Nevertheless, he also sanctioned the use of napalm defoliants, an Agent Orange, to deprive the Viet Cong of cover and destroy their crops. The surge of American personnel in South Vietnam alarmed Ho Chi Minh, foreseeing an inevitable invasion of North. Consequently, China pledged military assistance, prompting conscription of able-bodied men. Meanwhile, corruption and suppression of Buddhists by Catholic authorities in South Vietnam's government incited widespread discontent. In a poignant act of protest against President Diem's regime, a 73-year-old monk immolated himself as an onlooker watched in silence. Another monk repeated the mantra. A Buddhist monk became a martyr. Soon, others followed suit. Despite the clamor for greater liberties, President Diem imposed martial law and called dissent with arrests. Thus, the promised democracy in the South deteriorated into dictatorship. Siam's reign was on the wane. When Vietnam's military leaders, assured of US non-interference, orchestrated a coup, Diem and his brother fell to the assassins' bullets. While jubilation erupted in the streets, a new conundrum emerged. Who would succeed him? Kennedy's apprehensions materialized after his own assassination in November 22, 1963, with Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson thrust into the presidency. Despite fearing exacerbation of the situation, Johnson had opposed ZM's ousting. However, with ZM's demise, the Viet Cong capitalized, launching attacks across the countryside. This triggered a succession of 8 unstable governments in the South between January 1964 and June 1965. As the USS Maddox traversed the Gulf and encountered hostile fire from a North Vietnamese torpedo squadron, Ho Chi Minh was baffled by his Navy's action, swiftly reprimanding the impulsive officer. Amidst the confusion, the source of the attack remained contentious. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff advocated for retaliatory strikes, but Johnson demurred, insisting on a confirmed second attack as justification. In lieu of such confirmation, American pilots convinced of an initial attack were dispatched to target North Vietnamese naval installations and oil facilities. Hence, the American bombs fell on Vietnamese soil for the first time. The purported second attack, though not existent, led to Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution granted the President authority to aid any Southeast Asian nation facing communist threats, providing legal backing for Johnson's deployment of U.S. forces in Vietnam. In retaliation, North Vietnamese guerrillas targeted an American airbase near Saigon, resulting in the deaths of 5 American and the destruction of 5 B-57 bombers. Despite advisors urging Johnson to deploy ground troops and conduct airstrikes on northern targets, he resisted the former. However, the Viet Cong then attacked an American helicopter base of Pleiku, resulting in the deaths of 8 advisors and numerous casualties. Subsequently, on March 2, 1965, Johnson initiated Operation Rolling Thunder, a systematic bombardment of designated targets. This marked a shift from retaliatory strikes to an aggressive offensive, a decision concealed from the public. With Viet Cong assaults persisting, the US found itself heavily invested and unable to withdraw without appearing weak. Consequently, in March 1965, Johnson reluctantly committed ground troops to Vietnam. It became evident, as later revealed by the Pentagon Papers, that the conflict was no longer solely about combating communism, but also about avoiding humiliation. By the start of 1966, the death toll of American troops had risen to 2,344, with 200,000 men stationed in Vietnam and more en route. The Viet Cong controlled the majority of South Vietnam's rural areas, utilizing the Ho Chi Minh Trail spanning Laos and Cambodia, a complex network of jungle pathways extending over 12,000 miles. The objective was to disrupt the trails sufficiently to hinder enemy supplies. Despite reassurance to the American public about the effectiveness of military operations, the rising casualty figure fueled concern. General Westmoreland, who claimed victory could be achieved within 3 years, urgently requested additional funds. However, Secretary of Defense McNamara presented President Johnson with 2 options: negotiate a compromise with Hanoi or provide General Westmoreland with more troops. McNamara cautioned that the odds of victory were slim. Despite being advised of war's unwinnable nature, Johnson opted to escalate by sending more troops, leading to the preparation of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers for a conflict deemed by many in Washington as a lost cause. The struggle in Vietnam wasn't solely against the Vietnamese. It was equally against the unforgiving terrain. Troops had to navigate through dense elephant grass, prickly thorn bushes towering 20 meters bamboos, and jungle so dense that the progress was painfully slow, taking an hour to move a mere 100 feet. The jungle floor seldom saw sunlight, while finger-length black leeches inflicted wounds prone to infection. The landscape was littered with booby traps, landmines, and grenades, resulting in grievous injuries or death. Moreover, soldiers grappled with M16 rifles prone to jamming during gunfights, a flaw that often proved fatal. Despite prevailing in battles, American victories seemed futile. The enemy promptly replenished their ranks, and the stretched thin US forces found any captured territory swiftly reclaimed by the adversary. By the close of 1967, the death toll for Americans had soared to 20,000 despite assurance of imminent victory back home. This end burgeoned. By early 1968, 500,000 US troops were stationed in Vietnam, with assurance from American leaders of impending triumph. However, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong were devising a comprehensive offensive plan. Coordinated strikes on South Vietnamese towns and cities. A defeat in Saigon would compel American withdrawal. The offensive was timed for January 31st, coinciding with Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. Advance and we shall triumph completely, declared Ho Chi Minh to his troops. A 36-hour Tet truce commenced on January 30, allowing thousands of armed troops to depart for the holiday. The following day witnessed 84,000 Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese soldiers launching attacks on 36 out of South Vietnamese 44 provincial capitals, numerous American and ARVN military installations, in the 6 largest cities including Hue, Da Nang, and Saigon. Yet the execution of the Viet Cong and NVA's plan faltered amid fierce resistance from South Vietnamese and US forces, inflicting substantial losses on the attackers. For the first time, US soldiers confronted their adversaries directly. The Viet Cong were now in the streets, not just hidden in the foliage or buildings. They were playing America's game on its home turf. After months of intense combat, the Viet Cong were driven back. President Johnson hailed the Tet Offensive as a crushing blow to the communists. Of the 84,000 enemy combatants involved, 58,000 were either killed, wounded, or captured. It stood as a resounding triumph for America and the ARVN. The Vietnam War marked a turning point in media coverage as it became the inaugural televised conflict, bringing the harsh realities of the front lines directly to American homes. Up until the Tet Offensive, the public had been assured that the victory was imminent, with the North Vietnamese supposedly on the brink of defeat. However, the sudden onslaught of the offensive shattered this narrative, eroding the trust of the American people in their government. This disillusionment prompted widespread protests, culminating in President Johnson's televised address on March 31, 1968, where he announced a halt to bombing in North Vietnam in pursuit of peace. Alongside this decision not to seek re-election, Johnson's announcement sent shockwaves through the nation, redirecting his focus towards achieving peace. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. further exacerbated the nation's already deep divisions, reminiscent of the strife seen during the Civil War era. Adding to the turmoil, Robert Kennedy, campaigning for an end to the war, met a fate similar to his brother's, further fracturing the nation. Amidst this chaos, Richard Nixon emerged victorious in the presidential election, prompting to end the war and unite a fractured America. As he assumed office, the specter of the war loomed large, with 37 US troops already fallen. However, the clandestine maneuvering that secured Nixon's ascent to power remained shrouded in secrecy. Progress toward peace seemed tangible as the end election approached. Johnson had made significant strides, securing agreements to halt bombing and initiate talks involving all relevant parties. Yet, just days before the election, President Thieu of South Vietnam abruptly withdrew from peace negotiations. It was later revealed that representatives of the Nixon campaign had covertly intervened, prompting a more favorable outcome for South Vietnam if Nixon won. Despite Johnson's knowledge of these treacherous actions, he chose to remain silent, unwilling to divulge the sources of his information. Thus, Nixon's deception remained undetected, safeguarding his ascent to power. Amidst the stalemate of peace talkers and relentless continuations of war, American soldiers were tragically dispatched to their demise in futile conflicts. They found themselves embroiled in battles for territorial gain, such as the infamous Hamburger Hill, or to relinquish these hard-won territories to the enemy shortly thereafter. The sole metric that seemed to matter was the body count, even as protests back home raged on unabated. It became evident to Nixon that a shift in policy was imperative. The public patience had been exhausted. Thousands of lives were being sacrificed in vain. Thus, the doctrine of Vietnamization was set in motion. Gradually, the ARVN troops would assume greater responsibility, while American troops would commence their journey back home. Initiatives were undertaken to train the ARVN forces, with over 1 million M16 rifles, 40,000 grenade launchers, and numerous vehicles dispatched for this purpose. Both American and South Vietnamese authorities recognized the grim reality. If America couldn't secure victory with 500,000 troops, South Vietnamese stood little chance on its own. Despite Nixon's public declaration of success, the reality was far grimmer. On September 2, 1969, coinciding with the 21st anniversary of Ho Chi Minh's proclamation of Vietnamese independence, Ho Chi Minh passed away. Although military triumphs were recorded and casualty rates dwindled, opposition to the war only intensified. The revelation of My Lai massacre, where American soldiers mercilessly slaughtered over 500 innocent civilians, further fueled anti-war sentiments and triggered widespread protests. Mass demonstrations erupted across the nation, culminating in tragic events such as the killing of 4 students at Kent State and 2 more at Jackson State University. With peace negotiations deadlocked, Nixon initiated a bombing campaign around Hanoi, famously known as a Christmas bombing, resulting in the deaths of 1,600 civilians on December 26. Pressuring by the relentless bombardment, Hanoi eventually relented, leading to a final agreement within 6 days. The bombing had coerced them into accepting terms. Prisoners of war were slated for release, and American troops were scheduled to withdraw from Vietnam by March 29, 1973. As the last American forces departed South Vietnam, leaving behind only a contingent of 200 Marines to safeguard the American embassy and other installations in Saigon, the nation plunged back into the throes of a brutal civil war. Nixon had promised South Vietnam unwavering support in the face of adversity, but his resignation amidst the Watergate scandal in August 1974 left the country abandoned. Congress slashed aid to South Vietnam, with up to 20,000 ARVN troops deserting each month. Despite the provision of weaponry, ammunition shortages plagued the South Vietnamese forces. The North pressed forward relentlessly, decimating ARVN defenses with impunity. After 3 decades of conflict, the inevitable fall of Saigon loomed large. A mass exodus ensued as soldiers and civilians alike fled southward to evade the advancing North Vietnamese army. President Chu's resignation on April 29th marked the onset of the invasion of Saigon, prompting a desperate scramble for evacuation. Helicopters became the lifeline for evacuees, shuttling them to evading aircraft carriers and ships amidst chaotic scenes. To prevent overcrowding, helicopters were unceremoniously pushed into the ocean once filled. Faced with the specter of further bloodshed, South Vietnam capitulated, ushering in a period of re-education camps for countless individuals enduring sentences of up to a decade. ARVN cemeteries were either razed or sealed shut, as every trace of erstwhile South Vietnamese regime was systematically erased. After 3 decades of strife, 2 million lives lost, and millions displaced, the Vietnamese people found themselves united under a single communist banner, aided by Soviet support. Vietnam underwent a profound transformation towards a new socialist system. This involved the collectivization of agriculture, the abolition of capitalism, the nationalization of industry, and the appointment of planners to oversee operations in strict adherence to communist principles. Unfortunately, this led to an economic disaster, marked by a decline in the standard of living and widespread famine. Over 1.5 million people eventually fled the country, with 400,000 managing to reach America. In the words of John Kerry, the Vietnam War raised fundamental questions about the rationalization of destroying villages to save them, America's moral integrity in the pursuit of profit, the concept of free fire zones where anything moving was a target, and the disregard for civilian lives in the pursuit of military objectives, the manipulation of body counts to inflate success rates, the willingness to sacrifice lives in insignificant battles, and the instance of victory at any cost further underscored the tragic realities of war. Yet, amidst the chaos and loss, it's crucial not to forget the courage and sacrifice of those who fought on all sides. Their bravery and resilience amidst the chaos of conflict deserves recognition. The Vietnam War wasn't just a conflict between nations. It was a political struggle that forever altered the landscape of both America and Vietnam.